The Sherlock Holmes Advent Calendar. The Redeemer's Coming, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. 23. Hellfire and Judgment. Holmes, who had taken his crutch again, and I slowly climbed up the spiral staircase to the platform above the entrance gate, a part of the building that was clearly seen as having the original architecture of this abbey for the purpose of defense. Immediately behind us followed Brother Francis, who kept us at bay with Holmes's own revolver. When we arrived at the top, another door blocked our way out, and the abbot sternly ordered, "Open it up and keep moving." Holmes responded to this request, and we reached the platform that was outside. It had already darkened, but the full moon illuminated the clear winter evening with all its strength. It was cold, and at this height we were certainly 50 feet above the ground, and the wind blew around our ears quite violently. I looked down through the battlements on the cobbled forecourt of the abbey, covered with only a thin layer of snow, and came to the conclusion that a fall from that height could only be survived by a miracle. We turned around and stood with our backs to the abyss, face to face with the abbot. "And now?" asked Holmes. "What are we waiting for?" "On the fire," Brother Francis replied. "The library must be burning brightly by now. The old books are the ideal carrier. The high shelves and the wooden beams installed everywhere will catch fire next. In this way the roof truss will catch fire. It won't be long, and the whole abbey will become a fire pit. But by then the Reverend and I and Mary will be miles away, and the both of you will be dead." "Fire again?" I asked. "Can't you think of anything new?" "The confessional box was just a test run," replied the abbot, "and also an extremely successful diversionary maneuver, don't you think?" In the next moment, flames were already blazing through the roof of the monastery at some distance. Within a fraction of a second, the superstructure over the library, the source of the fire, collapsed with thunderous noise. All this played out behind Brother Francis, and although he had expected it, even waited for it, he turned around briefly in horror. This was the moment to act. In a hurry, I rushed towards the abbot to knock him to the ground and take the gun from him, but I had grossly miscalculated. Brother Francis quickly turned back in my direction and aimed the revolver at me when I was still about 6 feet away from him. Immediately he pulled the trigger. But instead of a shot, only a slight click could be heard. I looked down at my torso and touched it to make sure I wasn't hit by a bullet. Everything was fine. Again the abbot put the gun on me and squeezed the trigger twice. Again nothing could be heard but a click, while the arrogant grin slowly faded from Brother Francis's face. I turned my head towards Holmes's and asked, "Tell me, Holmes, can it be that your weapon isn't loaded?" My friend just lifted his shoulders innocently. "What the hell?" the abbot cursed before he pulled the trigger again, me staying his target. But again no shot was fired. I began to smile involuntarily and slowly walked the last steps towards Brother Francis. "Your game is over," I said with a dramatically sharp tone, demonstratively rolling up my sleeves. I would have done better to avoid this acting, because the abbot used the time to throw the useless revolver in my face. I stumbled back, and the next moment Brother Francis threw himself at me. We fell to the ground, and my opponent pushed me down with all his weight. Then I noticed that he suddenly had a dagger in his left hand, which he must have had hidden under his cowl. Slowly the tip approached my neck. I tried in vain to shake off the rabid monk. "For heaven's sake, Holmes," I cried, "do something at least." My friend walked comfortably to the battleground, took his crutch in both hands, and dealt a heavy blow to the back of the abbot's head. Immediately he let go of me, but then he gave himself a good shake to overcome the pain and his drowsiness. Then Brother Francis ran towards Holmes with the dagger in his raised left hand, but he again pulled out with the crutch as if it were a cricket bat, and hit the approaching attacker in the abdomen. The abbot dropped the dagger and waved around the platform with his face distorted by pain, first forwards, then backwards. "Be careful," cried Holmes as Brother Francis came dangerously close to the battlement. But it was too late. The abbot tipped over the edge with a loud scream. Immediately, I jumped in at the last second and was able to grab Brother Francis's right arm with my hands, but his weight was too heavy. He threatened to slip away from me. "Quick, help me, Holmes," I asked my friend. As soon as possible, Holmes came to the battlement, threw the crutch aside, bent over next to me, and stretched out his arms. "Brother Francis," he asked him, "give me your other hand." But the abbot looked Holmes directly in the face and shook his head. "Come on," insisted Holmes. "Watson can't hold you for long. You'll die if you don't give me your hand." Brother Francis still did not make any efforts to respond to the request and save his life, while my strength slowly left me. "Come on," Holmes repeated again, but in vain. "Your kingdom come, your will be done," the abbot recited, looking to heaven. Then he intentionally let go of my grip, looked us in the eye again, and plunged into the depths. "No!" shouted Holmes, turning away at the same time. I, on the other hand, involuntarily observed the fall of Brother Francis. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Immediately after the impact on the ground, the snow around the shattered body turned red from the leaking blood. The abbot was undoubtedly dead immediately. I turned to Holmes, who stared blankly at his own feet, and then I picked up his crutch and handed it over to him. "We could have prevented it," I explained. "It was his own decision." Holmes said nothing at first and looked around. By now the flames had seized most of the monastery roof and were already approaching us threateningly. "Come, Holmes," I hurried him. "We have to leave here." At last Holmes started to move, but immediately he stopped again to pick up his revolver. He looked at him and said, "Oh, look, Watson, in the last chamber of the drum would have been a bullet. Only the first 5 chambers were empty." "Are you serious?" I cried indignantly. "If Brother Francis had not only pressed the trigger 5 times, but also a 6th time, I would be dead now. Damn, Holmes, stop putting me in danger all the time." "Save it for later," said Holmes. "At the moment we don't have time for your petty complaints. Perhaps you have missed the fact that almost the entire Abbey is on fire. We have to look for Lestrade and Maria, and also render your friend the Reverend harmless." At least in terms of urgency, Holmes wasn't wrong, so I just said, "Let's go," and ran down the stairs first. When we arrived 2 levels down on the ground floor, a real inferno was revealed to us. There were flocks of flames everywhere, even on the ceiling the beams had caught fire. That way, the fire was spreading quickly through the building. Carpets, furniture, window frames, and doors contributed to this. In this way, a stone-built building could also be the victim of the fire. Plumes of smoke hanging in the air obstructed visibility. Nevertheless, we immediately noticed that the way to our room, where we had left Lestrade, Maria, and Brother Paul, was blocked by a wall of fire. Our only hope was that the 3 had escaped on their own in time without falling into the hands of the Reverend. All we could do was make our own escape from the Abbey. Across the remains of walls and glowing wooden beams, some of which were literally lined with flames, we made our way. The smoke became denser and made breathing more difficult. Eventually, Holmes began to cough and breathe stertorously and couldn't continue. "Go, Watson, save yourself," he commanded with last strength before collapsing right in front of me. In the next second, only a few feet behind us, the ceiling collapsed, a fireball hissing through the resulting opening to us. I suffered burns to my face and screamed in pain. I began to doubt our escape. But then I gathered all my remaining physical and spiritual willpower and pulled Holmes up, bent down a little, and put my friend's motionless body on my shoulders. "I'm not going to leave you behind, Holmes," I said firmly. "We'll get out of here." And then I straightened up and started running, while behind us Holmes's crutch caught fire. Apparently in this situation I unleashed the strength of a Trojan warrior, because I moved forward quickly despite the considerable burden. I no longer looked left or right, storming blindly on and on. Finally, I reached the entrance hall, some of which was already on fire, and jumped through the open gate into the open air. At some distance from the blaze, I gently placed Holmes in the snow and assured myself that he was still breathing. "Holmes," I said, giving him a pat on the left cheek, "you're not dead." My friend opened his eyes, blinking, and stammered, "I'm afraid not, my dear Watson." I laughed and then dropped on the cooling floor. We had made it. When we had recovered a little, we looked at the scenery. The Abbey was completely engulfed in flames. The fire broke out of all the windows. The roof truss burned brightly. Although the volunteer fire brigade of Twickenham, and soon after the one from Richmond, arrived, the building could certainly not be saved. Completely unnoticed and untouched by the chaos, lay beneath the battlements the abbot's body. The Franciscan friars who had escaped the fire stood there with soot on their faces and torched cowls, and I forced myself to count them. There were only 23, and I noticed immediately that one of the missing monks was Brother Paul. I informed Holmes of this, and we feared the worst with all the consequences. Not only Brother Paul, but also Lestrade and Maria must have died in the flames. We were inconsolable. But then, just seconds before the archway collapsed, the missing came out of the monastery. That is, at least Lestrade and Brother Paul were running, while they were carrying Maria, who had apparently not yet gained consciousness, in a linen cloth again. They dragged themselves and the young woman a few more steps away, then they sank, exhausted, into the snow. We immediately went there. Holmes greeted them happily, while I immediately checked Maria's condition. "It's nice that you survived," Lestrade replied. "I thought the devil had taken you." Suddenly, the largely destroyed monastery gate attracted our attention once again. With a loud scream, a person who was himself on fire stormed out. Through the wall of fire and across the rubble, he ran towards us like a human torch. It was Reverend Blake, who pointed my gun at us. The next second, I heard a shot, and the burning priest fell to the ground. I looked to the right of me and saw that it was Holmes who triggered. With the only bullet of his revolver, he had just prevented the last misdeed of the Reverend. Thus, the covenant of evil came to an end that night, and its two madmen were not given to a worldly judgment, but to the heavenly judgment of God. May they simmer in hell for all eternity.